Jeffrey Epstein's name has become one of the most disturbing symbols of power, secrecy, and systemic failure in modern history. What began as the story of a single wealthy financier eventually revealed a global web of abuse, silence, and protection that extended into the highest levels of society. The so-called Epstein Files are not merely legal documents or court records. They represent decades of ignored warnings, silenced victims, and institutions that repeatedly failed to act. To understand why these files matter, it is essential to understand who Jeffrey Epstein was, how he gained access to power, and how his crimes were allowed to continue for so long without meaningful consequence. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born in 1953 in Brooklyn, New York, into a modest, middle-class family. His early life gave no clear indication that he would one day become one of the most infamous figures of the 21st century. He was academically capable but not extraordinary, and his educational history remains vague and incomplete. Epstein attended Cooper Union and later New York University, yet he never earned a degree. Despite these, he managed to secure positions that typically required elite credentials, a pattern that would follow him throughout his life. From an early stage, Epstein demonstrated an unusual ability to gain trust, insert himself into elite environments, and benefit from opportunities that were inexplicably offered to him. In the mid-1970s, Epstein became a teacher at the Dalton School, one of Manhattan's most prestigious private schools. The appointment itself raised questions, as Epstein lacked the formal qualifications usually required for such a role. However, Dalton provided him with something far more valuable than a teaching salary: access through wealthy parents of Dalton's students. Epstein entered social circles populated by influential financiers, politicians, and business leaders. It was here that he met Alan A. Greenberg, a powerful executive at Bear Stearns, who later hired Epstein into the firm. This marked Epstein's entry into high finance, a world where secrecy, discretion, and personal connections often mattered more than transparency. At Bear Stearns, Epstein worked with high-net-worth clients and gained first-hand exposure to how extreme wealth operates behind closed doors. Yet his time there was short. In 1981, Epstein abruptly left the firm under circumstances that were never fully explained. What followed was one of the greatest mysteries surrounding his life. Epstein claimed to manage vast sums of money for ultra-rich individuals, yet very few clients were ever publicly identified. Unlike legitimate hedge fund managers, Epstein avoided regulatory scrutiny and operated through private entities that revealed little about their activities. This lack of transparency fueled speculation about how he sustained his wealth and who was truly backing him. As Epstein's fortune grew, so did his lifestyle. By the 1990s and early 2000s, he owned or controlled an extraordinary collection of properties across the world. His Manhattan mansion, one of the largest private residences in the city, was valued at tens of millions of dollars and equipped with extensive surveillance systems. In Palm Beach, Florida, he owned a sprawling estate near the ocean, which would later become central to criminal investigations. He also purchased Little St. James, a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, an isolated location that became one of the most controversial symbols of his empire. Additional residencies in New Mexico and Paris further illustrated the global reach of his lifestyle. Epstein's private jets were another key element of his operations. Flight logs later revealed frequent travel involving politicians, academics, business leaders, and celebrities. These records would eventually become part of the Epstein Files and fuel intense public scrutiny. It is important to note that the presence of a name on a flight log does not itself constitute proof of criminal behavior. However, the sheer number of influential individuals who moved in Epstein's orbit raised profound questions about how such access was possible and why so many warning signs were ignored. Behind the scenes, a far darker reality was unfolding. In 2005, Epstein's carefully constructed image began to crack when a woman in Palm Beach reported that her 14-year-old daughter had been sexually abused by him. Local police launched an investigation that quickly uncovered a disturbing pattern. Detectives identified multiple underage girls who described similar experiences involving cash payments, sexual acts, and a system of recruitment that relied on victims bringing in other victims. The consistency of these accounts suggested not isolated misconduct, but an organized pattern of abuse. The Palm Beach Police Department built a strong case and recommended severe charges. Evidence included victim testimony, phone records, and physical descriptions of Epstein's home that matched survivors' accounts. Investigators believed they were dealing with a large-scale sexual exploitation operation involving minors. However, despite the strength of the evidence, The case took an unexpected turn when federal authorities intervened. Instead of pursuing aggressive prosecution, Epstein's legal team negotiated a deal that would later be widely condemned as a miscarriage of justice. In 2008, Epstein entered into a controversial plea agreement that allowed him to plead guilty to state charges while avoiding federal prosecution entirely. The deal resulted in an 18-month sentence, of which Epstein served only 13 months. Even during that time, he was granted work release privileges that allowed him to leave jail 6 days a week for up to 12 hours a day. For victims, the outcome was devastating. Many were never informed of the agreement, despite legal requirements that they'd be notified. The message was clear. Wealth and influence could bend the justice system. This plea deal effectively silenced the case for years. Epstein registered as a sex offender, but he continued to live a life of extraordinary privilege. He resumed travel, socialized with powerful figures, and maintained his global network. For survivors, the trauma did not end. Many struggled with long-term psychological damage, including depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. Some described being intimidated by private investigators and lawyers, reinforcing their fear of speaking publicly. As years passed, public awareness of Epstein's crimes faded, but the abuse had not been forgotten by those who lived through it. Journalists, activists, and survivors continued to push for accountability. Their persistence would eventually bring the Epstein story back into the spotlight, setting the stage for renewed investigations and the unsealing of documents that would become known collectively as the Epstein Files. The silence surrounding Jeffrey Epstein's crimes began to break, not because the system suddenly chose justice, but because survivors refused to disappear. Among them, one name would come to define the second phase of the Epstein story: Virginia Giuffre. Her testimony did not merely accuse Epstein of abuse. It challenged the protective wall that had shielded powerful individuals for decades. Through civil lawsuits, sworn statements, and public interviews, Giuffre alleged that Epstein and his associates had trafficked her to influential men while she was still a minor. These allegations, while not criminal convictions against those named, forced a global reckoning with the scale and reach of Epstein's network. Giuffre's account described a system that operated with precision. According to her testimony, Epstein's organization recruited vulnerable teenage girls under the guise of offering money, mentorship, or employment. Once inside the system, these girls were allegedly coerced, manipulated, and transported across state lines and international borders. Giuffre stated that Ghislaine Maxwell played a central role in this process, acting not only as Epstein's partner but as an active facilitator who normalized abuse and enforced obedience. These claims would later become central to Maxwell's criminal prosecution, marking the first time someone from Epstein's inner circle faced serious consequences. Civil litigation became one of the few avenues available for accountability. Because Epstein had avoided federal prosecution for years, survivors turned to civil courts to seek damages and public acknowledgement of harm. These lawsuits generated thousands of pages of depositions, affidavits, emails, and sealed exhibits. Over time, journalists and transparency advocates fought legal battles to have many of these materials unsealed. When courts finally agreed, the result was a wave of documents that the public would come to call the Epstein Files. These records did not offer simple answers, but they exposed patterns of behavior that could no longer be dismissed as rumor. As documents were unsealed, the public learned more about Epstein's social universe. This strategy provided him with legitimacy and protection. When allegations surfaced, his connections created hesitation, doubt, and delay. Institutions that might have acted instead chose silence, often prioritizing reputation over responsibility. Central to many testimonies was Ghislaine Maxwell, whose background differed sharply from Epstein's. Born into wealth and privilege, Maxwell was the daughter of media tycoon Robert Maxwell. She moved easily within elite circles and possessed social credibility that Epstein lacked. Witnesses described her as a gatekeeper who managed access to Epstein, trained victims to comply, and punished those who resisted. While Maxwell denied these allegations for years, the consistency of survivor accounts drew increasing scrutiny from federal investigators. The turning point came in 2019, when renewed media attention and investigative reporting reignited public outrage. The Miami Herald's investigative series exposed the details of Epstein's 2008 plea deal and revealed how federal prosecutors had secretly protected him. The reporting prompted widespread condemnation and political pressure. Under this renewed scrutiny, federal authorities in New York reopened the case, this time armed with evidence that had been ignored or suppressed for years. Unlike previous cases, there was no immunity agreement and no special treatment. Prosecutors alleged that Epstein had trafficked dozens of minor girls between 2002 and 2005, using his wealth and influence to conceal his crimes. His arrest sent shockwaves through elite circles that had long considered him untouchable. For survivors, it offered a fragile sense of validation, a sign that their voices had finally been heard. However, justice would once again be interrupted. On August 10th, 2019, Epstein was found dead in his jail cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York. The official ruling declared his death a suicide by hanging. Almost immediately, serious questions emerged. Jail cameras malfunctioned, guards failed to perform required checks, and Epstein's cellmate had been transferred shortly before his death. These failures fueled public suspicion and intense debate. While no conclusive evidence has proven foul play, the circumstances surrounding his death ensured that questions would never fully disappear. Epstein's death had profound legal consequences. Criminal charges against him were dropped, as U.S. law does not allow prosecution of the deceased. For many survivors, this felt like a second betrayal. Once again, the man at the center of the abuse had escaped full accountability. Attention quickly shifted to those who had enabled him, particularly Ghislaine Maxwell. Federal prosecutors pursued her case with renewed determination, framing her not as a bystander but as an essential architect of the trafficking operation. Maxwell's trial, which began in 2021, became one of the most closely watched sex trafficking cases in U.S. history. Prosecutors presented testimony from multiple survivors who described how Maxwell recruited, groomed, and abused them alongside Epstein. The defense argued that Maxwell was being scapegoated for Epstein's crimes, but the jury was unconvinced. In December 2021, Maxwell was convicted on multiple federal charges, including sex trafficking of minors. In 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Her conviction confirmed a crucial truth. Epstein's operation was not the work of a single individual, but a coordinated system. As Maxwell's case concluded, attention returned to the Epstein Files. The unsealed documents continued to raise uncomfortable questions about who knew what and when. Some names appeared repeatedly, while others surfaced only once. In many cases, the documents reflected allegations, not proven crimes, a distinction that remains essential for responsible reporting. It was facilitated by a culture that rewarded wealth, discretion, and loyalty over accountability. The files also revealed the tactics used to silence victims. Non-disclosure agreements, financial settlements, and legal intimidation were standard tools. Private investigators followed accusers, and lawyers warned them of reputational damage if they spoke publicly. For young victims without resources, the threat was effective. Many remained silent for years, carrying trauma alone while Epstein continued to operate freely. These revelations forced a broader conversation about how legal systems can be weaponized against the vulnerable. By the time the public fully grasped the scale of Epstein's crimes, the opportunity for criminal accountability had largely passed. What remained was a moral reckoning. Governments, universities, media organizations, and social elites were forced to confront their own failures. The Epstein Files did not provide closure, but they exposed the mechanisms that allowed abuse to thrive in plain sight. They showed how prestige can override evidence, how influence can delay justice, and how silence can be more powerful than truth. After Jeffrey Epstein's death and Ghislaine Maxwell's conviction, a new phase of the story emerged, one defined not by criminal trials, but by unanswered questions, public suspicion, and a deep erosion of trust in institutions. For many observers, the Epstein Files were no longer just about individual acts of abuse, but about how entire systems allowed those acts to persist. The failures surrounding Epstein's prosecution, incarceration, and death became symbols of a justice system that appeared unable or unwilling to hold the powerful accountable. This perception, whether fully accurate or not, has had lasting consequences for public confidence in law enforcement, the courts, and political leadership. One of the most controversial aspects of the Epstein case has been the rise of conspiracy theories. These theories flourished in the absence of complete transparency and were fueled by the extraordinary circumstances surrounding Epstein's life and death. Claims emerged suggesting that Epstein was connected to intelligence agencies, that his operation was part of a larger blackmail scheme, or that his death was orchestrated to protect powerful individuals. While none of these theories have been proven, Their persistence reflects a broader truth. When institutions fail to provide clear answers, speculation fills the void. Responsible examination of the Epstein Files requires separating documented facts from unverified claims, even when those claims feel emotionally compelling. What the available evidence does confirm is that Epstein maintained relationships with individuals of immense power and influence. The files revealed that he positioned himself as a benefactor, advisor, and connector, offering access to wealth, intellectual circles, and exclusive experiences. This strategy created dependency and loyalty, which in turn discouraged scrutiny. When early allegations surfaced, they were often dismissed as misunderstandings or attacks motivated by greed. This pattern of disbelief is not unique to the Epstein case, but it is especially visible here due to the scale of wealth and influence involved. The files show how reputation can function as a shield, deflecting accountability until the damage becomes impossible to ignore. Another key issue raised by the Epstein Files is the question of why so few people faced legal consequences beyond Epstein and Maxwell. For many viewers of this case, the absence of widespread prosecutions feels like evidence of a cut. In reality, the explanation is more complex and deeply frustrating. Criminal law requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and many allegations, while credible and consistent, lacked the physical evidence or corroboration necessary for prosecution years after the fact. This legal reality does not invalidate the experiences of survivors, but it does highlight the limitations of justice systems when crimes are hidden, delayed, or deliberately obscured. The Epstein case also forced a reevaluation of how society treats survivors of sexual abuse, particularly when the accused are wealthy or powerful. Many of Epstein's victims were teenagers from disadvantaged backgrounds, making them easy targets for manipulation and coercion. The files reveal how their credibility was questioned, their motives scrutinized, and their pain minimized. This imbalance is one of the most disturbing aspects of the story, as it reflects a broader cultural tendency to protect status over truth. The long delay in accountability serves as a warning about what happens when survivors are not believed. Beyond the legal implications, the Epstein Files have had a profound cultural impact. They reshaped conversations about consent, exploitation, and power dynamics. They exposed the ways in which abuse can be normalized within elite spaces, hidden behind philanthropy, intellectualism, and social prestige. Universities that accepted Epstein's donations were forced to confront uncomfortable questions about the cost of such funding. Media organizations faced criticism for failing to investigate earlier. Political leaders were asked to explain their associations. In each case, the files acted as a mirror, reflecting not only individual failures, but systemic ones. The global reach of the Epstein story also revealed how interconnected modern power structures are. Epstein's activities crossed state and national borders, exploiting gaps in jurisdiction and enforcement. His ability to operate internationally complicated investigations and delayed cooperation between authorities. This aspect of the case has prompted renewed discussions about the need for stronger international mechanisms to combat human trafficking and sexual exploitation. The Epstein Files demonstrate that crimes committed by the wealthy are often transnational in nature, requiring coordinated responses that many systems are still ill-equipped to provide. As time passes, the Epstein Files continue to be analyzed, debated, and reinterpreted. New documents may emerge, and additional testimonies may surface, but the core lessons of the case are already clear. Epstein's rise was not the result of a single failure, but of many small compromises made by individuals and institutions. Each decision to look the other way, to accept an explanation without scrutiny, or to prioritize reputation over accountability, contributed to the longevity of his abuse. The files show how evil does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it operates quietly, protected by politeness, wealth, and fear. For survivors, the end of Epstein's life did not mean the end of their struggle. Many continue to seek healing, recognition, and justice in whatever forms remain available. Civil settlements, public apologies, and institutional reforms cannot erase the harm done, but they can acknowledge it. The Epstein Files have given survivors something that was long denied to them: visibility. Their stories, once buried in sealed documents, are now part of the historical record. This visibility does not guarantee justice, but it makes denial far more difficult. Ultimately, the Epstein Files matter because they force society to confront uncomfortable truths about power and accountability. They challenge the assumption that wealth equates to virtue or that influence implies innocence. They reveal how easily systems can be manipulated when transparency is absent and oversight is weak. Most importantly, they remind us that silence is not neutral. In the Epstein case, silence enabled abuse, protected predators, and delayed justice for years. The legacy of the Epstein Files is still being written, not in courtrooms alone, but in the choices made by institutions and individuals going forward. Whether this story becomes a turning point or merely another scandal depends on what is learned from it. If the lessons are ignored, the conditions that allowed Epstein to operate will remain intact. If they are taken seriously, the files may serve as a catalyst for change, ensuring that future victims are heard sooner and that power is no longer a shield against accountability. In the end, the Epstein Files are not just about one man or one set of crimes. They are about a system that failed repeatedly and the human cost of that failure. They stand as a record of what happens when justice is delayed, when victims are dismissed, and when influence outweighs truth. The question they leave behind is not simply who was involved, but whether society is willing to prevent such abuse from happening again. That question remains unanswered, and its answer will define the true legacy of the Epstein Files.